Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughn Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday, that means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, Roger, we're traveling back in time to the 1990s, the early 1990s, Roger. That was a long time ago. Yes, back in the 1990s, the early 1990s, and Superman. We're talking about Superman. And we're talking about a particular era of Superman, which I thought was a great era of Superman. And that was the Triangle era, which are collected in a couple giant volumes like this one. This is the Triangle Era Omnibus Volume 1. And I do also have Volume 2. I just got this as a gift. I have a friend who always sends me giant comic books at Christmas time. And this friend just sent me this. And last year, this same friend sent me this. So let's talk about it. The Superman, the Triangle Era, which is, like I said, an era I enjoyed a lot on Superman. So let's go back in time and talk about Superman back in the 80s and into the 90s. And what the heck is the Triangle Era anyway? Why is it called the Triangle Era, Roger? Well, we'll get into it. So back in 1986, it was John Byrne revamped Superman. And Steve and I have both talked about the revamp of Superman. I probably should revisit these books and talk about them again. But John Byrne revamped Superman. And he was hired to do this by DC. Crisis on Infinite Earths was going on, that miniseries, which pretty much restarted the DC universe. And John Byrne was hired to do Superman. John Byrne was a big deal comic book creator from Marvel. And DC figured a lot of, Marvel fans would follow John Byrne over to DC to see what he was going to do on Superman. Now, Superman had sort of been languishing by the early 80s. Not that they were bad comics, but they were not selling like they used to. And there was the feeling that Superman was a little bit behind the times, Roger. And so John Byrne was sent in to update it, which he did, and he was successful. He got me on board. That's when I became a Superman fan. It was when I was reading John Byrne's Man of Steel. And I have mixed feelings about the series now because I feel like there was so much history in the Superman comic books, and there was so much mythology in the Superman comic books. And just about all of that was jettisoned when Byrne took over. No more Bottled City of Kandor, no more Supergirl, no more Krypto the Superdog, which was the greatest sin of all. Superman was a lot less powerful than he had been before because, this is a thing. Sometimes comic book creators who lack imagination decide that, you need a less powerful Superman. Otherwise, he's not interesting, even though they wrote interesting stories about Superman for 50 years before this. Whatever. Anyway, I won't get into all that now. But looking back, I definitely think he got rid of too much in his revamp. But it was what it was, and it worked. It did work in that it did get me on board as a Superman fan. And I read all of the issues that John Byrne did, and he was on the book for a couple years. And when he was doing it, there were 3 Superman comic books. There were Superman, which started over at number 1. There was Adventures of Superman, which continued the old numbering from the old Superman series. And there was Action Comics, which was still going on. And they were good. I liked them. I have my reservations now, but at the time I thought they were great. But John Byrne left the book. He left Superman after a couple years, but he did a lot of work on these titles, I have to say. But he moved on to other things after a couple years, and the editor, Mike Carlin, was left with a new Superman, and he had the challenge. Okay, how do I keep up sales without John Byrne, and what do I do with this character? And it could have been a disaster, but it wasn't. I think the Superman comic books were better after John Byrne left, which is no knock against Byrne, really. However, as a writer, I think John Byrne often leaves something to be desired. I think he's a fantastic artist when he applies himself. But as a writer, he wasn't always the best. And I think the writing improved dramatically on the Superman titles. And I think just the books became better after John Byrne left. And a lot of those stories could be found in The Exile and other stories. This continues directly after John Byrne leaves. And so these were the Superman stories that were done by Jerry Ordway and Dan Jurgens and Roger Stern and a bunch of others, taking John Byrne's Superman and creating new stories, and they were really, really good. These stories are all the stories, or most of the stories, that came before the Triangle era, which began in 1991. So early 90s Superman. So the Triangle era, it's called the Triangle era because Superman became very highly serialized in that there was a new Superman book that came out, Superman the Man of Steel. And so what they did is they made it so that there was a Superman comic book every week. And the story would continue week to week with different creators doing each book. But one week you would have Adventures of Superman, then you'd have Superman, then you'd have Action Comics, and then you'd have Man of Steel. So almost every week, except for an odd week here and there in the early 90s, you would have a Superman book. Every Wednesday there was a new Superman comic continuing the same Superman story. And so, Mike Carlin would have these big meetings where they would decide where the Superman book was going to go, and they would all work together on these stories. And it became this long-running Superman serial full of adventures that were fantastic, and some of the greatest stories. And it's here in this era that I think Superman really achieved what John Byrne wanted it to achieve when he took over, which was, it became a modern comic book. Superman was no longer, outdated. These comic books were very popular, and they were fantastic. Now, the first issue with the Triangle was actually Superman number 51 in 1991, and you see that little triangle there under Superman, under the Superman logo, and there's Mr. Z. So watching this back, I realized I didn't actually explain what the triangle meant. So every issue of Superman would have this triangle. This is Superman, Man of Steel. And the triangle there says 1991, 27. So every year would have a new numbering. So in 1991, this was the 27th story from 1991. And then when we got to 1992, it would start over again at a number 1, so that every week you could keep track of which story went where. It was handy. And as far as the creative teams, we had Dan Jurgens, Jerry Ordway, Roger Stern, Louise Simonson, and John Bogdanove. Is it Bogdanov. I never actually heard that the name pronounced, so I don't know. But he was fantastic. And this era of Superman was just great. And I was a huge Superman fan by the time these came out. I was following these books week to week regularly, and they were a big reason why I continued to be a Superman fan in my 20s. I was still reading other comics. I was reading mostly DC comics at this time. But Superman was really the reason I kept coming back to the comic book store at this period. Marvel sort of began to lose me right around the 1990s. There were still some books I was picking up, Captain America and some others from Marvel. But Marvel seemed to be in a downward spiral. And DC seemed to be picking up steam around this time. It felt that way to me. I'm sure others will remember that era differently, but that's how it felt to me. DC seemed particularly exciting at this time. Now, these omnibuses are gigantic. So they're each, 1,000 pages or something? Let me take a look. And they're full of extras at the bottom. Yeah, this one is 1,300 pages. And at the back, you do get some pretty cool extras. But the stories are just wonderful. And these stories take over, like I said, from the John Byrne era and move into the era of the mid-90s. And I think it was 1993 when they killed off Superman. And that was the biggest Superman story of all. It's when they killed off Superman. And a surprising thing for me with these omnibus volumes is that they actually go into the death of Superman. I figured that what they would probably do is they would do a couple of these and just stop the stories before the death of Superman stories, because we already have a death and return of Superman omnibus. But no, those issues are in here too. These omnibus volumes are gigantic. It's very appropriate for this time of year. They are gigantic, but they're awesome. We did get a new Supergirl at this time, who is a different Supergirl than Kara Zor-El. This was kind of a weird Supergirl. Still, even now looking back, I feel like they should have brought back the original Supergirl, and I felt that way at the time. I think right around this time, I really started to read the older Superman stories. And I really started to miss a lot of the Superman mythology, which had been jettisoned by John Byrne, because I was catching up on all these old stories. And I was thinking, this old stuff is actually pretty cool. Eventually, of course, they did bring everything back. So, they had to bring back Krypto. They had to bring back the original Supergirl. But it took years and years for that to happen. And I don't think it needed to wait that long. Nevertheless, the stories were pretty great. Superman gradually became more and more powerful when nobody was looking, which is always what happens when you depower a superhero like Superman. Eventually, they're going to get their power back. And towards the end of this volume, we get to the tragic death of Superman, which, like I said, it surprised me that it's in here. So if you get this omnibus volume, and if you already have the death of Superman and the return of Superman, you're going to have doubles of some of these issues. But I feel like what they're doing is they're just going through the whole Triangle era, which means this volume ends. This is the second omnibus. This volume ends with Superman being dead. He's dead by the end of this. And so the next volume, and there probably will be one after that, I would assume. I can't remember how long the Triangle era went on, but it went on for a while. After that, Superman will return with his terrible 90s hair. I don't know if you guys remember Superman's terrible 90s hair, but he came back from the dead and he had a mullet. He had a super mullet, Roger. It was embarrassing. But he kept his super, and it was the dumbest thing because, of course, Clark Kent returned at the same time Superman did. And Clark Kent had long hair and Superman suddenly had long hair. And Clark Kent kept his in a dopey ponytail. It was really dumb. It was the one really dumb thing about Superman's return from what I remember. So the next omnibus, the next Triangle Era omnibus will have the return of Superman, probably, I would assume, and the beginning of the super mullet era of Superman, which fortunately did not last forever. Somebody came to their senses eventually and cut Superman's hair. I still have like a Superman statue from that era where Superman has his dumb long hair. I have that in the other room, actually. But yeah, so we'll probably get an omnibus of mullet Superman coming next. And eventually the Triangle Era ended, but I don't remember when it ended because it went on for a long time in the 90s. And eventually they came out with another Superman book, Man of Tomorrow. So even those odd weeks where there was, like a fifth Wednesday in the month, where normally you just wouldn't have a Superman book, they plugged Superman Man of Tomorrow in there. So every single week, without fail, you would get a Superman story. And it was glorious, for a Superman fan. Every week, you were getting these great comic book creators writing these great stories. I thought they were great. I loved them. And eventually it ended, though. Eventually the Triangle Era came to an end. And I just can't remember when that was. Somebody will know, and they will write it down in the comments. I will have to, because I have all those issues. I just don't remember. It's been too long since I read them, Roger. The 90s were a while ago. It was right around, I know it was before, I think, the turn of the century. Remember the turn of the century? Yeah. And Superman comics were still good at that point. But I do miss the great Triangle era. It was a wonderful time in comics for Superman. And yeah, it was fantastic. And these giant volumes, let's see if I could hold them both up. These giant volumes have the first big chunk of that era going into Superman's death. So yeah, just me reminiscing about the Triangle Era of Superman because it was so great. And I had such a great time reading those when I was in my 20s. I still had hair at that time, Roger, but I didn't have a super mullet. I never did. I swear. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.